All right, so are you ready for a deep dive?
Hmm.
We're going to explore this question of democracy in Africa.
Okay.
Is it a blessing, or could it actually be more of a curse?
Hmm. It's a question that I think challenges a lot of our assumptions.
Yeah,
Because, I mean, we always hear about democracy as this good thing,
right.
but is it always the right fit? Especially when you think about all the different unique histories and social contexts of all these different nations.
Exactly, and that's what makes this deep dive so interesting.
Yeah.
We're going to be looking closer at this article from Prudent Entertainment News that came out last month.
Okay.
It was published September 28th, 2024, to be exact.
Okay.
And it's titled, The Reasons Why Africans Must Avoid Democratic Governance. I know that title sounds a little bit provocative,
Yeah.
but the article itself actually presents a more nuanced view.
Oh, okay.
It acknowledges that there are potential benefits to democracy,
Right.
like accountability and representation,
Yeah.
but it also really dives into the ways that these democratic systems can be exploited, particularly in regions where corruption is a problem or where there's ethnic tensions that are just simmering beneath the surface.
Right.
So let's just start by getting a sense of what the current landscape looks like when it comes to democracy in Africa.
Okay.
It's not a single picture, right?
No, not at all. You have countries like Ghana and Senegal that are often held up as these examples of successful democratic transitions.
Okay.
They've managed to hold peaceful elections,
Yeah.
and you actually see power changing hands without violence or coups.
Right. So that's the good news.
Yeah.
But this article also points out that many other African nations are really struggling
Yeah.
with these serious challenges to their democratic institutions.
Absolutely. And corruption is a major factor here.
Okay.
Transparency International consistently ranks a lot of African countries really low on their corruption perceptions index.
I see.
And that should tell you something about the level of distrust in governments
Yeah.
and the erosion of public faith.
And it's not just about perception, right? This
Oh.
corruption has real-world consequences.
Oh, absolutely.
It takes resources away from things that people need, like healthcare and education.
Right.
And it creates this environment where it's tough for businesses to operate fairly.
Right.
And for just the average person to get ahead?
Exactly.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head.
And then you also have this issue of political instability, which is often connected to corruption.
Right.
And you think about places like Sudan and Ethiopia,
Okay.
where internal conflicts and violence have made it almost impossible to establish any stable democratic institutions.
So you kind of have this cyclical problem where the instability just breeds more corruption.
Right.
And that fuels even more instability.
It's a vicious cycle.
It's a downward spiral.
And then on top of all that, you have the problem of electoral manipulation,
Right.
which the article highlights as being super widespread across the continent.
Yeah, and we've seen examples of that, right?
Yes, we've seen cases in Uganda and Zimbabwe where elections have just been riddled with accusations of fraud and voter intimidation and the suppression of any opposition voices.
It's like the system itself is rigged,
Yeah.
and that makes people just lose faith in the whole idea of democracy.
Right.
And it's not just a theoretical concern either,
No.
because the article goes on to argue that these drawbacks
Huh.
have very real and tangible consequences for the development of Africa.
Yes. One of the most significant consequences is the way that democracy, as it's practiced in many African nations, can actually make these existing ethnic tensions worse.
Wow.
Yeah.
So instead of it being this unifying force, elections can actually become these flashpoints
Right.
for conflict between different groups that are all vying for that same power and those resources.
Yeah, and it's easy to see why when you have a system where it's winner takes all
Right.
and where political power is often linked to these specific ethnic groups,
It creates a very dangerous dynamic for sure.
it does. It's like the system itself is encouraging division and conflict.
Right. And when these tensions turn into violence, as we've seen in a lot of cases, it just sets back development by decades.
Absolutely.
And it makes those already fragile foundations of democracy even weaker.
Right.
I thought the article used a really powerful phrase to describe this.
What was that?
It said, the societal fabric becomes frayed.
Hmm.
And I think that really captures the feeling of fragmentation
Yeah.
and instability that can happen
Yeah.
when these democratic systems are manipulated or they just fail to address those really deep societal divisions that are
Deeply.
already there.
Uh-huh. It's not just about these ethnic tensions either.
Oh, okay.
The article also mentions concerns about how democratic processes, particularly in countries that have weaker institutions,
Oh, okay.
can actually lead to policy paralysis.
I see.
You get these situations where there's so much political gridlock
Yeah.
that even basic reforms just can't get implemented.
Right. It's like the system gets so bogged down
Uh-huh.
in these endless debates
Yeah.
and all these procedural hurdles that the real issues that people are dealing with. Poverty, lack of healthcare infrastructure, all that stuff just gets put on hold.
Exactly. And it creates this sense of frustration
Yes.
and disillusionment among people,
Right.
which can further erode faith in the democratic process.
Totally. It's like they start to feel like democracy isn't actually doing what it's supposed to.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've talked about these kind of broader challenges, but the article also digs into some specific case studies
Yes.
to show how these issues are playing out in real life.
It does. It focuses on Nigeria, Zimbabwe, and Uganda
Okay.
as examples of how these democratic institutions can be manipulated and undermined.
Wow.
And each case kind of highlights a different angle of the problem.
All right, let's start with Nigeria then.
Okay.
The article really focuses on the 2019 general election,
Yeah.
which were criticized a lot for just being full of irregularities.
Yeah.
Talking about vote buying,
Yeah.
ballot box snatching, to even just outright intimidation of voters and candidates.
Yeah. And what's really worrying is that it wasn't just like a few isolated incidents. It was widespread and systematic,
Wow.
which makes you think there was a real attempt to manipulate the outcome.
It really makes you wonder if the results were legitimate at all.
Right.
And if those elected officials really represent what people wanted.
Yeah. Yeah.
Then there's Zimbabwe.
Uh-huh.
And the article focuses on their 2018 elections
Okay.
and the legal challenges that came after.
Right. The opposition party claimed that the elections were rigged to make sure that the incumbent president, Emerson Mnangagwa, won.
Right.
They took it to the Constitutional Court, but their case got dismissed.
And that dismissal just makes you wonder about how independent the judiciary is in Zimbabwe.
Yeah.
Because if the courts aren't able to keep the executive branch in check,
Right.
then what's stopping those in power from taking advantage of the system?
Exactly. It sets a dangerous precedent
Yeah.
and just weakens the rule of law even more.
And lastly, the article talks about Uganda, which has been led by President Yoweri Museveni for over 3 decades.
It's a prime example of how a leader can use democracy just for show.
Right.
Holding elections, having a parliament
Yeah.
to make things seem legitimate when they're really